want to welcome everybody back to the MacAdmins Campfire sessions. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our second speaker, Hamlin Krewson. Hello, Hamlin.
Hello, sorry.
Slight technical difficulties. Yes, we can hear you just fine. Okay. Thank you.
Flip. Do you see my slide now?
Yes, they are up and you are good to go.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I do hope that's not going to flip back and forth. Well, my name is Hamlin Krewson, and I work as a system support analyst for the Art of Education University, where our mission is we grow amazing art teachers by providing rigorous, relevant, and engaging learning more at the education.edu. I'm thrilled and more than just a little terrified to be talking with all of you about my journey today. It feels a little bit like a therapy session to me. So if you wouldn't mind signing an NDA at the end of all this, that'd be great. My talk today, as you've already heard, is from Apple Genius to IT Pro, or as I like to call it, how I learned to love the shebang. And I'd like to start off by telling you just a little bit about who I am. So I grew up in the 70s and 80s when computers were just beginning to be available and affordable. And the very first computer I ever used was an Apple, either a 2 or a 2E, I'm not really sure. At the time, it seemed like those computers were kind of everywhere. And even my tiny school, where I graduated with 37 other students, had a lab of them, and every student had at least one 5 1/4 inch floppy tucked away in their Trapper Keeper. Growing up in my family was maybe a little bit different than yours. See, we had sort of a motto. I'm not really sure what to call it, but my grandparents were born in 1918, and that meant that not only did they grow up during the Great Depression, they also survived the Second World War. And as a product of that generation, they had an outlook that life was as good or as bad as you made it out to be, that you needed to concentrate on what was good about the moment you were in. To top that off, my mom taught English and AP psychology in high school, so I was really lucky that when I brought home my frustrations or problems, I had my therapist right at the ready. So this family outlook on life was frequently impressed upon me in multiple variations. A set of often differing words intended always to provide the same basic concept. A reminder that nobody else can make you feel one way or the other, and that life is whatever you make of it. Over time, I realized that there was always a single common thread to this concept. And from that was born my own personal philosophy, shortened to 2 simple words. Life is. I started my IT career right out of college. Having just spent 8 years attaining a pair of art degrees, it seemed the most logical thing to do. I'd long made a hobby out of solving technology issues for myself, my family, and friends. And one of my friends got me an interview with the local computer store. I'm sure that I learned a lot at this job. I know that this is where I began learning about OS X. It was my first foray into documentation and Windows support, Linux, and more. But looking back on it, none of that was really important. I think for me, the most important thing to gain from any experience has to be bigger than the things I know about the stuff. That store had all of your basic nerd stereotypes. We had sales nerds, network nerds, blinky lights nerds, Linux nerds, hardware nerds, Mac nerds, and Windows nerds. And you may think it odd coming from someone who only supports Macs, but it's that last nerd that became sort of a quiet mentor for me. It isn't that I learned everything I know from him. It's not that I shadowed him or worked with him constantly. It's simpler than that and a little bit more profound. He's an incredibly brilliant person and was at that time a terrific resource for me anytime I had a Windows support question. But there's always been one thing about him that kind of sticks out to me. Something that I see in my mind whenever I think of him. And it's a thing that I've ended up carrying with me as a tool that I use to make any interaction go just that little bit smoother. You see, whatever question I would ask elicited not just the right answer, but a simple set of gestures. And I realized from the first time I saw them just how powerful they really were. Following a question, he'd pause for just a moment. He'd tilt his head back and look up. He'd take a slow breath in and out, and finally he'd answer. It was that set of gestures that in a brief moment he displayed calm. He was reflective. He showed a sense of command over the question and gave the impression that he knew exactly the answer. To be fair, he did. Not only did he know the answer, but he could tell you where, on which page number the answer was in the MCSE book. I can't do that. Most of us can't do that. But we can present that sense of calm and command over a situation. It's thanks to him that I became known as Unflappable, always calm, and always ready to answer or find an answer. Life moves fast enough on its own, and the more you can slow down a moment, the better you'll be at seizing it. Life is fast. In my life, I've had several times when I didn't have a job. For one reason or another, I'd find myself looking for the next job, sometimes for many long months. Before being hired by Apple as a Mac genius, I spent somewhere around 2 years not working. After Apple, I spent another 4 or 5 months, and I had 9 months between my last job and my current one. Unemployment is harsh, and often it's an unexpected reality of our lives. For those of you who, like me, don't, can't, or won't support Windows, it can be tough to find a job, and it can be a long time between available postings. This makes for a frustrating experience, where you find yourself filling applications and sending resumes, often to jobs you have no hope of or interest in attaining. You can find that you have a lot of time on your hands to contemplate your career choices. My first bout with unemployment was the worst. At that time, having only worked in the field for 1.5 years, I had a real lack of understanding about what my chosen career required of me and what resources were available. I didn't know, but I didn't know. Still, I learned a thing from that experience that helped make the difference for me the next 2 times around. I found that my best days involved more than just resumes or job applications, more than just watching movies or sitting around the house or filling up my time. My best days were active. At that time, we lived in Ames, Iowa, not far from Iowa State University, and once a week, they have a public used equipment sale. It was something that could keep me busy. Going to that sale, maybe picking up a $30 computer, and maybe chatting with the other nerds in the area. If I wasn't doing that, played around a lot with the relatively new OS X, looked for resources to learn anything. I knew about BrainBench. Does anybody remember BrainBench? And soon I found Press3, where I attained my first ever certification as a Mac CSE. Say it with me. Ooh. My next opportunity came after working at Apple for 12 years, 9 months, and 11 days when I was promoted to customer. While I don't recommend being at one place for that long, it was an experience I wouldn't trade for anything. And leaving was tough. It was uncomfortable, and it was unexpected. It was a few months before I found my next role, and I found myself having good days and bad days. On the good days, I spent time reading and preparing for a certification that I ended up not ever getting. I found open source projects to download and install and try out. I worked through videos in LinkedIn Learning, and I played a lot of disc golf. On the bad days, my PS4 got a lot of use. My third opportunity was just before working at the Art of Education University, and this time around I was prepared. I'd reached a point where I felt it was time to part with my employer. Between the stress of constantly being behind, a lack of time to dig into learning new things, and a somewhat personal frustration, I needed to get away from work. This was September of 2020. COVID was real. And one of the biggest topics I recall in the news was how concerned people were about their livelihoods and their jobs. And in the midst of all of that, I tendered my resignation. I was lucky enough to be in a financial position to feel safe in doing so, knowing that I could hold out for a while as I looked for something that fit well. I had some very specific goals and some goals that were less so. I spent some of my time learning more about open source projects like Monkey, Monkey Report, Snipe It. I'd already signed up for Jump Cloud and worked on learning that solution better. I worked on developing my own Airtable bases and shell scripts. Got my ACSP and my Network Plus for fun. This time around, I actually found it less stressful to be unemployed than it had been working. My best days in unemployment are always the days that involve me being mentally active, whether it's reading about technology, trolling the forums or Slack, learning something new, or chasing a random technology squirrel. Having something related to technology to do when I'm not working is key to helping maintain my sanity and stay fresh in my skills. Seize your opportunities and make the best of them. Life is opportunity. Working at Apple was a unique experience. You had your customer right there next to you, and you had the opportunity to ask questions and interact with them as you worked to resolve their concerns. The experience gave you an opportunity to begin a mini relationship with every new person you met, and you met a lot of new people. This was a full touch experience, one where you had the ability to work directly with the customer and the device, often from beginning to end of their experience. While asking questions and working through the problem, you could take a moment to find out how their day was and get to know them as real, honest-to-God human beings. By the end of my tenure there, I had customers who would come in and demand hugs or remember the name of my kids or who knew that I'd just gone through a rough divorce. After being promoted to customer, my very next role was working with a local managed services provider. A former Apple coworker of mine had started his own business. In many ways, this was a perfect transition for me. It shared many of the same goals and philosophies as Apple. So all of the skills that I'd gained regarding how to approach and work with customers directly applied. What I found most difficult was the idea that we should be able to solve issues remotely. No touch. For nearly 13 years, I'd had the luxury of a full touch experience. This was a completely different beast, and almost overnight, I had to learn a new paradigm. How to solve something sight unseen with only the description and a client's ability to answer questions. And one of the first things my new boss told me was just how excited he was, how he's looking forward to me helping improve processes and bring some automation to the stack with the use of webhooks. And I remember putting on a big smile, nodding, and thinking, what the frack is a webhook? Over the course of the next 2.5 years, I redeveloped myself. I learned what a webhook was and how to use it. I learned the ins and outs of mobile device management, not once, not twice, but 3 times, with Meraki SM, Jamf Now and Pro, and Mosel Business. I learned to troubleshoot devices over the phone, over the command line, and from Jump Cloud. I learned networking, database development, services integration, and so much more. As a company, we went from a client base of mostly residential and a few 1 to 5 team members with no MDM to a client base of about half residential and several 1 to 20 member teams with MDM, identity management, remote screen sharing, and more. We moved from mostly 1 hour on-site model to mostly remote support model in time to be fairly prepared for the pandemic. Life has changed. I find myself frequently in our ticketing solution, opening a ticket and doing some research, adding a note with the results before composing any sort of response. It's a habit. I think of the note as my way of gathering my thoughts, providing context to myself and my team, as well as an opportunity for us to comment and add context as we find it. Whether you're writing research and troubleshooting notes, a knowledge base article, install instructions, a product manual, documentation is good documentation look like? It's a question that I've struggled with for close to 20 years. I know what it is when I see it. But the question is always, how does one communicate to another what that really looks like? A lot of us have heard of or participated in the peanut butter and jelly sandwich exercise. And it's a great exercise to get us thinking about what goes into not just great PB&Js, but great documentation. What does that tell us, though? I mean, obviously, you can get some great amusement from poorly constructed PB&J recipes. What else? We learned that leaving out key pieces of information can be devastating to the intended results, but what's a key piece of information? How do we as IT professionals learn to recognize that? For a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, a key piece of information is pretty easy to determine. I know that I have to have a knife for spreading it. I can't just use my fingers. I could. I can't just leave the knife on the table. I need to know how to get the peanut butter out of the jar, and I probably need to know that I have to unscrew the cap on the jar first. And it seems pretty key that the peanut butter and the jelly should be spread onto some bread. When it comes to documentation in IT, it can be a little more obtuse. Working as a genius, for instance, we had to always include in our troubleshooting documentation how to reproduce an issue. I remember a new team member once asking, how do they write the steps to reproduce physical damage? It's not like you can drop a computer, damage it, and see how you get the same results. So I said, well, and you can write your description of the damage, what you see, and that you have visually verified what you see on the computer. And somehow that turned into our team deciding that they could use the phrase visually verified everywhere. Soon we had documentation for everything from a hard drive failure to a slow computer with a step to reproduce being visually verified. Great documentation is a roadmap. It's a set of turn-by-turn instructions complete with landmarks, approximate ETAs, points of interest, and a place to stop for lunch. Great documentation doesn't leave the reader wanting, and yet it provides an experienced reader with some obvious opportunities to jump ahead. It's a partnership between you, the author, and we, the reader. Life is communication. I learned shell scripting because I needed to. Well, need is maybe a strong word. Really wanted to do a thing. I've had a fascination and a love-hate relationship with the shell for most of my life, but I didn't really learn to script until around 2008 or so. At Apple, we weren't really supposed to use the terminal, and probably for good reason. It's not friendly. It's just a big open screen. And with the wrong command or the wrong syntax, you end up with an error, the wrong result, or a potential catastrophe. Scripting didn't come naturally. At the time, all I really knew was a smattering of utilities and how to use man. What I did have was a goal. We had developed a habit of using Ditto to help individuals with getting data from drives. And at some point I got it in my head to write something to give us a little bit of a status update about the progress of this tool. It worked. And the results of that script that are a script that I have serious mixed feelings about. It's in my GitHub repo. You're welcome to go and check it out. Have a laugh, have a cry. I'm not sure it still works, but at the time it did exactly what I set out to do. What I really love about the script, though, isn't what it does. It's what it taught me. That project took me months to get a working version 1, and I ended up with, I don't know, 800 lines of code and maybe 600 lines of changelog. The thing is, this personal pet project ended up teaching me not just how to shell script. I learned new aspects of documentation, how to build algorithms, how to deconstruct a process, and a new aspect of learning. Shell scripting for me isn't just about adding a bunch of commands to a file. It's not just knowing the results of a specific set of commands or gathering them together or creating a flow to have a desired outcome. For me, shell scripting is art. When painting a scene, you first break your scene down into shapes, colors, hues, intensities. You have to understand your objects and the components, how things flow together and where the eye moves. And the same goes for scripting. Before you write a script, you have to break it down into a set of goals. It's important to know what you want out of the script and build a set of steps and algorithm that you can get that can get you to that end result before you then translate those steps into a scripted set of commands. Learning any new process is fascinating. It's fun, terrifying, frustrating, and difficult. There are hundreds of resources and opportunities for learning. Video series for free and cost, books, tutorials, online documentation, friends who know the things, training courses, lovely presentations, and more. And what I've learned for myself is that I can go through those training resources, and then a year later, I'll be looking for the same information. It doesn't stick on its own. What works for me is to have a goal, and not just a goal to learn. That's not enough. I need a goal to do a thing, a real, honest project that will impact my work or my life. With that, I can watch just the training videos I need for where I'm at. I can search the forums to understand how to do a thing or why my attempt to do a thing is failing. I can set my own pace, choose my own resources to pull from, let my own skills and knowledge set my starting point, and use those skills to reinforce what I know, even as I'm hitting a wall. Life is learning. So, what does it mean to be an IT pro? How do you know when you've arrived? Is it when you're dubbed a pro by your peers? Maybe it's when you've made it as a MacAdmin. Could it be when your job title has the word pro in it? Or maybe it's once you've gathered all of the certifications, a specific job, a specific bit of knowledge. Maybe it's when you're managing hundreds of devices or when you're working with multiple cloud services and bridging them together. Or it's when you learn how to automate all of your tasks. The truth is that for me, it's all of those things. It's any of those things, and it's none of those things. IT pro to me is a decision. It's a choice, a lifestyle. It's learning something new about technology because it will help you with your next big goal. It's learning new technology for fun and then going to work. It's waking up and deciding, I've done what I can here, and I'm going to move on to something bigger. Choosing a role bigger than what you've done, moving from working on and fixing one computer at a time or one customer at a time, and choosing to become a solutions expert for a small team or a large company. Life is adventure. I've been talking for a while, maybe not as long as I intended. And I want to thank you for being willing to stick with me on this journey. I've talked about my personal philosophy, a concept that has shaped how I look at life and what it brings to my plate, how it shapes the way I see my role in my career. And now, I want to tell you briefly about my personal motto. This is a phrase that sat dormant in my brain for close to 30 years before I dredged it up. Words that have become my comfort and my battle cry. You see, over the last weekend, I was working on finishing this presentation, getting my thoughts into one cohesive structure. And Sunday night rolled around and I felt pretty good about it. It wasn't going to be phenomenal, but it was good, and I knew it had some value. I woke up Monday morning and I knew I felt different. I decided to read through what it was once more and mark out how long it took to get through so that I could know just how much of your time I would be taking from you. One has to have goals. I got about 2/3 through and I stopped. I was bored and suddenly worried that it was silly and not at all in a good or interesting way. I kept it open for the day thinking there were still a few things I could work on with it. Things that, if successful, might just make the difference. And as I was finishing up for the day and getting ready to head home, all the way downstairs, I decided to send a note to my boss. He'd been helping out here and there, and he seemed genuinely interested in how it was turning out. So I told him that there were a few things I wanted to work on with it. I wasn't feeling good about it, but I thought probably this is just, I had read it too many times and it was probably okay. I spent the evening ignoring my thoughts on it, steadily becoming more and more stressed. And at 9:30, I decided I would go out for a walk. Hopefully, I could reset and be ready to work on at least one thing with the speech before I went to bed. I popped my AirPods in, connected my phone, and started a chill mix in Apple Music. I stepped outside and I got 30 feet before it struck me what I'd been doing all day. I'd fallen into a trap. By telling myself it wasn't quite what I wanted and thinking I should work on a few things with it to get it in better shape, I'd sent myself spiraling. I was in the trap of imposter syndrome. The idea that it wasn't good enough to be that I wasn't good enough to be talking with you all or presenting my thoughts. And ultimately, I knew if I stayed on this path, I would never feel good enough to talk about it. I had to get myself out of this funk. I reminded myself that I'd made a commitment and I was going to go through with it no matter what. That ultimately it didn't matter if what I'd written was good, great, bad, or terrible. I pointed out to myself what I was doing, and suddenly I saw my grandfather from when I was no more than 4 years old. It was Christmas morning at my grandparents' house, and the unwrapping of presents was complete. I was sitting there on the living room floor, playing with whatever toys were still there. My grandfather was sitting in his chair, and he must have thought I looked sad or maybe a little too serious. He set his glass aside, and he looked down at me. He cleared his throat, and he said, "Cheer up. It'll get worse."
Thank you, Hamlin.
Trying to stop sharing here. Maybe.
Okay, so we have a couple comments. I'll start with Bruce. I still have a press 3 cert on that odd paper somewhere.
At least it wasn't just me.
And then we have a comment that I think Very much appreciated. It says, please share this with the presenter. Thank you for sharing your story. As someone who wanted to be a teacher and instead became an IT helper, was laid off, got a job at the Apple Store, and 20 years later, I'm now a MacAdmin. Thank you for talking about all the ups and downs, but especially the imposter syndrome part. So impactful. So thank you.
Yes, I'd like to echo that as well. I really appreciate you sharing your story. I think it's really important to hear, and I appreciated hearing it. I thought it was great. So thank you for putting that together and taking your time to talk about it. Bob also, we have a comment from Bob who says, thank you for sharing your experiences with us. I think it helps to get validation from peers. Which I think what your message about validation in itself is very important. You know, it's any of those things or none of those things or all of those things. It was a great message.
I really appreciated the opportunity to be able to do this. For as frustrating as it was to try to put this together, it was a great experience.
We have one more comment that says it was a great story to hear for sure. Agreed. So it seems like we've all very much appreciated your story. And as Rusty said, I will also echo that that was a wonderful experience that you shared.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, if there's any additional questions, we'll ask you to send those off to the PSU Mac channel on the MacAdmins.org Slack. Hamlin, thank you again for taking the time for delivering today's second session.
You're welcome. And again, thank you for the opportunity. This was very fun.